Hi everyone, thanks for watching this video on podcasting. Today we're going to talk about downloads. That's something that's very important obviously to many podcasters because we put the work in the show, we upload it to the internet, and then we want to know, is anybody listening? And then we want to know, okay, now that I know that people are listening, is this enough? Is this good? Is this bad? Should I quit? We really have a tendency to overanalyze our download numbers sometimes, and we're going to get into that a little bit today. But I'm also going to put in perspective to you what you should expect and what's realistic and kind of what the trends are out there. But before we get into that, I want to start off with something that I think is really important to remember before we start diving into numbers and things. One of my colleagues, Cliff Ravenscraft, has talked about this a couple of times because he gets a lot of emails from people that are wanting to know how they can get their podcast downloads up. So he gets emails from people going, "Hey Cliff, I'm only getting 300 downloads per show. What can I do to get that number up?" And he says he generally has a couple of reactions to those emails. One is, of course I'm going to help you do that. That's what I do. But the second thing is he always gets a little concerned when he reads sentences like that say, "I'm only getting 300 downloads per show." And the reason why that concerns him a little bit, and this is understandable because I've thought about this myself, is it's one thing to obsess over the people who aren't listening, but it's a whole other thing to kind of dismiss how many people are listening. Because think about that, even if it's 300 people, that's still 300 people that are taking time out of their day to listen to your content. And that's relevant. That's very, very important. And I would even say if you spend a little more time trying to curate your relationships with those listeners and work on getting good content to them, that in of itself will probably lead to more and more listeners. The other thing that I tell people a lot when they start to think that their numbers are low, like maybe let's not say 300, let's say 150 downloads per show. And they're thinking, gosh, how can there be so many people on the internet and I can only get 150 people to listen? Well, that's a whole other story as far as strategies to gain listeners. But what I would tell you is, if there's 150 people and you look at the stats and it looks like that they're listening to every single show, what that would also tell me is if you have 150 people that like what you do, there's another 150 people out there that are going to like it too. They just don't know you exist yet. Okay, so think about that before you panic about the number of people that are listening. Now, as I said before, I bet you're wondering, when you look at your downloads, how good are those numbers in the grand scheme of things? Well, I host my podcast through Libsyn, and they're a very popular, widely used podcasting hosting service, and they provide us with numbers. They let us know, they look at all their stats, the podcasts they've got and everything, and they let us know how those folks are doing and how that compares with what we're doing. So let's take a look at the numbers that they just released in August of 2016. All right, take a good look at these numbers. Does anything surprise you? How about that top number? The median 50%, 169 downloads per episode. So you know what that means. That means if you're pulling in 175 downloads per episode, you're doing better than half of that group. The top 20%, they're getting about 1,500 downloads per episode. The top 10%, 4,100 downloads per episode. And then you have the top 5 and higher, you've got 10,500. And then if you're in that top 1%, 62,000 downloads per episode. All right, so beyond those numbers, I can tell you that Rob Walsh over at Libsyn says that if your show's pulling in about 500 downloads per show, Libsyn recognizes that as a successful podcast. Now, let me just say, if you've been around for a year or two, maybe even 3, and you're not there yet, that doesn't mean you're necessarily a failing podcast, because the truth of the matter is it takes time for most of us to be able to build an audience. I mean, is it possible you could launch a podcast and within the first few weeks you have hundreds and then maybe thousands of people that are listening to you? Of course, but I don't think that's necessarily something that everybody expects, because at the end of the day, if that were true, we wouldn't need podcasting conferences. Consultants wouldn't have to be really pushing businesses to get into this and tell them why it's important or why it's beneficial, because it was just easy just to record something, upload it, and then thousands of people listen. It tends to be a marathon and not a sprint. So if you're just getting started, you shouldn't panic if you're not seeing numbers that you think you should be seeing. So I've been to a couple of those really big podcasting conferences. In fact, I've been to Podcast Movement twice. And one of the years that I went, my current podcast, Assembly of Geeks, had only been out for about a year. And to be honest with you, we were pulling about 130, 135 downloads per episode on a really good day. And I caught up with another one of my colleagues, Daniel Lewis, and said, hey, here's what I'm pulling right now. If I wanted to make a goal to double that number, what's realistic? What should I really shoot for? 6 months? 3 months? And he said, I think if you want to double that number, you're looking at maybe a year. So that should really put into context of how it really is a marathon and not a sprint. But I also will tell you that I was able to go to that conference the next year, catch up with Daniel, and tell him that we actually grew that audience 3 to 4 more times. Tripled, almost quadrupled that audience in a year. So, it's not so bad to have a realistic expectation and then exceed it, because that can happen as well. So when you're looking at your download numbers, what should you focus on? Should it be how many you got in a day, how many you got in a week, how many you get in a month? Well, the month number of downloads per month is a nice number to look at, obviously, because it adds everything up and probably gives you a pretty good number. But that's really not what you should focus on. I mean, have fun with that number, but that's not really telling you much about your podcast. I think what you need to focus on is how many downloads do you get in the first 24 hours? And then the second thing I think you should focus on is how many downloads did you get for that first week? Because if you start to see some consistent patterns there, like the number is generally the same on day one and in that first week, you're probably looking at your subscribers. And then you can shoot to get that number up as you move forward. So let's quickly wrap everything up that we went over today. Number one, remember, when you look at the number of people that are listening to your show, don't dismiss it by saying, oh my gosh, that's not enough, I should be getting more. Really value the people that are taking time out of their day, especially if it's a weekly podcast. They're taking time, they're fitting you into their schedule every week. Value those people, curate that relationship, continue to give them good content, and as a podcaster, continue to try to improve what you're doing, because that's also going to help you grow those downloads. Number two, remember that this is a marathon and not a sprint. More often than not, are there exceptions to the rule? Absolutely. But there's nothing wrong with just slowly building over time. It's just like anything else on the internet. If you have a blog, a YouTube channel, it just takes time to build that following. And then finally, just remember, focus on downloads in the first 24 hours and then what the downloads are in the first week. Because I think that's really going to tell you a lot about what's happening with your podcast and who keeps coming back to listen each and every day, each and every week. Because, if the number's the same each time you post it, those people are going right out and immediately getting your show as soon as it posts. And that's going to tell you a lot. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments section. I'll answer them there, or I might even answer it in a future video. If I don't know the answer to the question, I might be able to direct you to the right place. If you found the information today to be valuable, I hope you'll take a few moments to subscribe to the channel. I'll have more content coming very soon. And of course, you can always check out my website, Scott Murray Online. If you're on Twitter, you can find me at Mr. Scott Murray. I hope you found this video to be helpful, and I thank you very much for watching.